You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. All right, you're listening to Tragedy and Hope, dissected by Jay Dyer on jaysanalysis.com. And we covered in the last talk, the first 250 pages or so, that led up to World War I. And just to recap briefly, this is where Quigley explained to us that the shift that he called the European shift involved the basically change in ideology from pre-industrial civilization to industrialization, which reorganized the social order, as well as things like market capitalism, market liberalism, Adam Smith, and so forth. And the notion of secularism, separation of church and state, the ideas basically that are promoted by the Lodge, right? The democratic republicanism, right? The erecting of the secular republic that we saw in both 1789 and 1776. And I would add that, just as a caveat, you'll see this same dialectic played out today, even in alternative media, where you'll have proponents of libertarianism who would represent the American branch, the Girondin branch out of the French Revolution of the Revolutionary period, the founding fathers of the U.S., versus the more Jacobin, Illuminist, Weishaupt, communist fathers of the French Revolution of 1789. And these two branches appear to have differences, and on one level perhaps they do, but when it comes down to it, they're both sides of the same dialectic. And that's what we're going to look at today as we talk about the move towards World War I and then past World War I. And we saw that World War I as well, from the sinking of the Lusitania as a false flag to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian nationalist organization, the Black Hand, that those were likely provocations on the part of British secret intelligence or perhaps some other nefarious, darker occultic group, right? And we know that the occultic groups and the intelligence agencies often intertwine, and have for a long time. And so we're going to be talking about, we talked about the Rhodes Roundtable Group, the Milner Group, the Clivenden Set, and how this was the pattern for who pretty much controls the globe in our day, right? And that is linked to the European banking dynasties, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds in the U.S., and they are on the same team, and that coterie functions as the inner circle of initiates that Cecil Rhodes hatched, his scheme that he hatched, as well as the notion of creating central banks in all these countries, and the central banking system, this fiat system based on control of currency, the issuance of currency, originally the gold standard in the 1700s, which would transition into the fiat standard of our day post 1973 and Nixon Shock Doctrine and all that, into where we are now with electronic banking and meta fiat currency, I guess you could even call it. But it's important that World War I was very crucial in this in terms of weakening Germany, and you'll note that Germany was the focus of both World War I and II. Primarily. Why? Well, because of the threats that they represented to Western power. So you have two threats. You have the Germanic, Austro-Hungarian, Habsburg Catholic power, represented largely by German states that did not capitulate to the Protestant Reformation. And then you have the Russian power, the Orthodox ethos, Eastern Orthodoxy, that also represents in a way a rival power, because you have to understand that it's not just about politics in banks, that also religious ideologies figure into this heavily, because religious ideologies in a way, determine how large groups of people are going to believe, especially if they're Catholic or Orthodox. And as likewise with Protestantism, and so much of the ascendant power structure that we'll see over the last 500 years in the West will intimately be tied into the Protestant Reformation and the ideas of Protestantism, as well as similarities to Jewish ideas. And so there is a Jewish element to this in terms of Jewish power and banking power that would become ascendant, particularly through the Rothschilds, in terms of the establishment of the State of Israel, through the Balfour Declaration. But you have to understand, as well, as Quigley will point out in many chapters, that it's a coterie, as we said, of many bankers. And so there will be Vatican banking and Catholic banking that will figure prominently into this, particularly in France in the 19th and 20th century, that we'll have a whole chapter on. As well as we said, I said to Tim Kelly yesterday, Japanese banking. So by the mid-20th century, Japan had been taken over by I think he says 8. They're called Shaibatsu, and the Shaibatsu are the big banking corporate oligarchs in Japan. And all 8 of those families had control of the entire nation of Japan, for example, by the mid-20th century. And this is important because this shows you the same pattern and setup of central bank, puppet emperor, in the case of Japan, the emperor, right, who's just kind of a front guy. And we'll see the same thing in China with Sun Yat-sen, which Quigley will deal with in a chapter. And as I mentioned to Tim Kelly, Sun Yat-sen was very pro-Western insofar as he was a Mason. And you have to understand that the origins of modern Freemasonry do come out of London. Once again, we start to see a pattern here, right? Modern banking, City of London, Royal Society, modern science, empiricism, panopticism, pragmatism, utilitarianism, revolutionary capitalist ideology. What else? All of these ideas, socialism, Marxism, also London-based, London. And so London is kind of this octopus that just sort of spits the black oil to the rest of the globe. And that's how they maintain their power. And so you've got banking dynasties and the British Crown together for a long time, particularly, as we mentioned with Tim Kelly, since the period of Cromwell, and prior to that even, of course. And this is how we see the world go through this, quote, shift, and the turn towards materialism, the turn towards secular philosophy, scientism. These are all crucial key aspects of the developments that took place in the Anglo-Saxon world, as Alexander Dugin accurately points out in the interview that I did with him and in his works. So we're up to Versailles, and we saw that Versailles was a means by which the banking establishment could bring about reparations, which is a penalty, right, on the whole of Germany after this war-based reconstruction of the nations. And so out of this will come the Bank for International Settlement. So I'm going to read a bit here from Quigley dealing with Versailles, which is the settlement conference post-World War II, and this took place June 28, 1919, Germany versus the Western elite. And there was a Supreme Council of 10. It consisted of the head of the government and the foreign minister of each of the 5 great powers: Britain, U.S., France, Italy, and Japan. The group met 46 times from January to March in 1919. And it was, unfortunately, a very ineffective group, Quigley says. In the middle of March, there was a sharp dispute over German-Polish frontiers that was leaked to the press, and the Council of 10 was reduced to a Council of 4: Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau, and Orlando. And these 4 held 200 meetings in the period of 13 weeks between March and June. And so they finally put together the Treaty of Versailles. And when the treaty with Germany was signed in 1919, the heads of the government left Paris and the council ended. And so you have these reparations. And what's most telling here is what Quigley says on page 271, where he explains that after all these meetings, the valuable practice was ended in Britain. Let's see. He's talking about some of the reparations. He says the valuable practice was ended by Britain in 1923 in protest against the French determination to use force to compel Germany to fulfill all these reparation clauses. After all the meetings of the peace conference, the political leaders were assisted by groups of experts. This is crucial. So what's behind World War I? Here you go. Groups of experts and interested persons, sometimes self-appointed. Many of these, quote, experts were members of the international banking fraternity. It's page 271. That's not me. That's what Quigley says. These experts were of the greatest importance. They drew up the great debts that would be exacted upon Germany, pretty much over the top. The idea behind this is to put you and your descendants into debt slavery. That's the penalty here. The treaty with Germany was made by the Council of Four, assembling the reports of various committees, fitting the parts together, and ironing out various disagreements. The chief disagreements were over the size and nature of the reparations, the nature of the League of Nations, and the territorial settlements in 6 specific areas: the Polish corridor, the Upper Silesia, Saar, Fiume, the Rhineland, and Shantung. When the dispute reached a peak, Wilson appealed to the Italians, and so here's Woodrow Wilson, basically, as an operative of Colonel Edwin Mandell House and the London bankers, reworking the world, really. And so this is where we get we need the League of Nations to prevent these great wars. And the League of Nations was, of course, a banking establishment creation. And so the original peace treaties consisted of 5 parts. He's talking about the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations, new territorial provisions, disarmament provisions, reparation provisions, penalties, and guarantees. So the League of Nations basically existed to fleece Germany. That's what it was created for. And I should add as well, even though Quigley doesn't mention this, this fall of Austro-Hungarian Empire, he says the provisions of the treaty were such that they completely destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was reduced from 115,000 square miles to 32,000. It went from 30 million to 6 million inhabitants. And so a lot of land was lost. And why does the papacy at this time, Benedict, I think the 15th, supports the League of Nations? Why would that be? Why is Benedict the 15th the Pope? Why would you support, unless I guess you're cajoled into it by the banking cartel, why would you support the treaty that basically decimates the Austro-Hungarian Catholic Habsburg Empire? Well, that doesn't really make much sense unless you are the bankers have their hands around your throat. So we also have to understand that the infiltration of the Vatican by Masonry, it was not new to the 20th century. This had been going on at least since the 1700s, possibly prior to that, but writers like Malachi Martin and Keys of This Blood actually date the occult infiltration to 1500s with Medici's and Renaissance magic and all that. Other writers argue the same thing. Some of that's kind of fuzzy, Harry. I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm not saying there weren't Renaissance magicians like Pico della Mirandola or Marsilio Ficino or Cornelius Agrippa, right? I mean, this is going on, but how far this infects the Borgias and the Medicis and the papacy at that time, that's up for debate. I think there's some interesting discussions of that in another civilization book that maybe we'll do down the road by Jacques Barzun. It's called The Civilization of the Renaissance, I believe is the name of it. But it's a really good book, and it will deal with that. And so if we want to get into that in more depth down the road, we can. But keep in mind, this is the same cartel, okay? It's the same cartel behind the Royal Society Institute for International Affairs, as well as the Royal Society's scientism, propaganda, the philosophy propaganda of the British imperialists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Bentham, pragmatism, utilitarianism, all of these same philosophies come out of the same British establishment, right? And as well as the modern corporate structure, we can't forget that with the British East India Company, with its monopolist perspective, right? So the Bank for International Settlements is what also comes out of this, right? So the reparations, the reason for this, the Bank for International Settlements is, we've got to have reparations. So, well, what does that require? Well, that requires a massive central bank, and this massive central bank will function ultimately for the entire globe. Now, that's not where we're at yet in this period, but it was established in 1930, right? So this is 11 years after the Treaty of Versailles, and it's based on a lot of these same principles of the reparations following Versailles, is what I'm trying to say. And so this conference, it was originally intended to facilitate the reparations, is what I'm trying to say. And so the Treaty of Versailles after World War I leads to the notion of, we need a trustee for the German government for its international loans, right? So Germany's going to have to pay through immense debt, as I said. And this was, the institution was then dedicated to this purpose in 1929 by what's called the Young Committee, from a conference at The Hague, was where they determined this. And this leads to the Brussels Protocols, right? So the BIS's original task was reparations, and this quickly became obsolete. Oh, so it wasn't actually about reparations, was it? No. It was actually about the fostering of cooperation between all member central banks. Exactly. Yeah. So war in Germany and reparations was the facade for the step 2 of erecting the move towards global government, primarily through monetary means. And that's why the banking establishment, Federal Reserve style system, which is a public front for private cartel families, that is the means by which this this global conspiracy, as we might call it, is constructed. And now, at the outbreak of World War II, as we'll get to down the road in many chapters, the BIS will take on a newer, bigger role, right, similar to its role before, where they'll actually just say, give us the German Reichsbank gold to pay for whatever else you owe, right? And who will be some of the initial directors of the BIS? Well, it will actually be Nazis, believe it or not. Whoa, wait a minute. No, so what? Oh, we'll see. We've got collusion here, right? So between 1933 and 45, the BIS board of directors will include Walter Funk, prominent Nazi, Emil Puhl, Hermann Schmitz, and the director of IG Farben, Baron von Schröder, the owner of the J.H. Stein Bank. So you see that I'm not saying that it's all German Nazi. I'm not saying that it's all Jewish. I'm saying that those kind of things really don't matter at the top, except for certain people. Certain people certainly have an ideology. But the BIS begins with Nazi bankers. And so by the time of the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, this is where you'll have the reparations, of course, being put on Germany again, and we'll move into the dollar as the world reserve currency. Harry Dexter White, Henry Morgenthau, right? Here's Zionist element, I guess, from the U.S., Secretary of Treasury at that time, and John Maynard Keynes, right? All of these big guys will be involved in the talks and decision making on the behalf of the banking power for Germany once again at World War II. So we really have the smashing of Germany is what's going on here. And now don't think that Russia is immune to this, because the Bolshevik communist Marxist philosophy was exported to Russia, as we know from Professor Anthony Sutton, whose work jibes very well with Quigley. So you have to understand that, as I've argued many times, that the ideologies are weaponized to wreck nations. And so you export Bolshevism, export revolutionary thought to weaken, destabilize, destroy countries. And then you come in to solve the problems, the chaos that you created with warfare, conquering, reparations placed on the people, reorganizing the economy through IMF-style loans, which will come in the future. Right? I mean, we're still in the period of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but as we move into the future, it'll be the World Bank, IMF, right, who will be essentially exacting the loan sharking upon the countries. And we've seen this with IMF coming into Greece, IMF coming into places like Spain, Ireland, right, in the last, 8-10 years. And this fleecing occurs after you've had the destabilization, the coup, the revolution, or whatever, again, fostered by the same powers. Right? This is the Joseph Stiglitz talks about this as the IMF Shock Doctrine, right? The several point, it's either four main points, I think, 4-point banker plan, 5-point banker plan. That's in the excellent article by Greg Palast, the globalist who came in from the cold, where he describes the pattern, the stages of what the IMF does in the various countries to bring them back into line or to reorganize them into the next phase of the business program. So that's where we're at. And of course, we will get to the BIS in much more detail as we move further into period of World War II. But we're not there yet. So now we talked about reparations, and let's look a little bit more about what Quigley has to say about the reparations, because they're crucial to understanding how they are the means, the banker plans right now. So there were stages to this, and we have the preliminary payments of 1919. We have the London schedule of payments. This is May of 1921 to September 24. Then we have the Dawes plan of September of 24 to January 30. Then you have the Young plan, 1930 to 1931. The Hoover moratorium, 31 to 32. And then the Lausanne Convention of 1932. And these are just really stages of reorganizing the, it'd be like if you reorganize your debt, right, or consolidating your debt, right, through 1-800-CONSOLIDATE debt. This is the big scale version of that. And we're talking billions of dollars, $2 billion a year in interest, Quigley says. It was what Germany was originally tagged with, right? 82 billion was, quote, excused. Yeah, right. 8 billion was paid by 1921. Although the Entente powers contended that only 8 billion had been paid, they sent Germany numerous demands and ultimatums for more and more payments. And they threatened to enforce payment with, I guess, more war, Quigley says on 305. And Germany was to pay on the remaining 50 billion at a rate of 2.5 billion a year in interest. And so, wow. So basically, again, never-ending debt. So it doesn't, I'm trying to figure out the exact debt. He doesn't say in this section exactly what the debt is, but we're talking, billions and billions, which is a lot of money in the 20s and 30s, right? Enough debt, basically infinite debt. We could just write it up to a debt that you can't ever pay, and that's the point. And so what does this do? Well, this is economic shock doctrine. So even though the war's over, your economy is under attack, and this is economic warfare. And some idiot I was commenting with on some thread somewhere was like, what are you talking about? Economic warfare doesn't even make any sense. Well, no, I'm sorry, but that's one of the first aspects to warfare is economic warfare, right? Sanctions. And so these reparations on Germany are just outrageous. It's phenomenal. And you can see why it's ultimately about wrecking one of your chief rivals, if you're the London banking establishment. So that is, again, we have to understand that what we see today in the world is essentially no different. It's the same strategy that's exacted upon other countries. We saw it in the Ukraine, right, with the IMF after this coup and the installation of the Western puppet in the last couple of years. This coup it then leads to economic destabilization. And then the IMF says, oh, here's $18 billion in loan to fix your screwed up economy, which was screwed up from the machinations of the West. Now he says that one of the through these stages of the plans, right, for World War One. Here's an interesting quote: "The Dawes Plan was a J.P. Morgan production." Again, it's the bankers, openly. It was designed by American banker Charles G. Dawes. It was concerned only with Germany's ability to pay, and decided that this would reach a rate of $2.5 billion a year. That's what we said. After 4 years of reconstruction, Germany would be given a loan of $800 million to pay on $5.1 billion in reparations that year. I mean, so, geez. This plan did not supersede the German reparation obligation already established in 1921. And the difference between the Dawes plan of payments and the plan of payments of the London schedule were added to the total reparations of debt. Thus, Germany paid reparations for 5 years under the Dawes plan and owed more at the end than it owed at the beginning. It paid reparations for 5 years under the Dawes plan, 1924 to 29, and owed more at the end than it did at the beginning. You see, it's a scam. It's a scam. That is page 308. Now, what happens as a result? Well, this leads to tremendous inflation because Germany is, trying to pay this preposterous debt that's being exacted on them. And this leads to crazyflation, I think Max Kaiser calls it. Well, this leads to insane inflation. And so I'll read a bit of what Quigley explains here. He says, the deal embodied in the Young Plan, named after the American O&D Young, who was a J.P. Morgan agent, served as the chairman of the committee and drew up these new agreements in June of 1929. 20 governments signed on to these agreements by January of 1930. The agreement with Germany provided reparations be paid for 59 years. So you see, it's about putting your whole nation in debt and all of the future assets and energy and persons, your progeny, as slaves. In the 59 years for debt, which I assume this is the debt is all still there, because how will you ever pay off the interest on all this? 1.7 billion marks in 1931 to a peak of 2.4 billion marks in 1966, and then declining to less than a billion marks in 1988. So I guess even in the 80s, they were still paying on World War I reparations. The earmarked sources of funds in Germany were abolished except for the 660 million marks a year, which could be, quote, commercialized. And all protection of Germany's foreign exchange position was ended by placing responsibility of transferring the reparations from marks to foreign currencies squarely upon Germany. To assist in this new task, a new private bank was erected, called the Bank for International Settlements. Here we go. So this is 1930, and we're up to the period where we're, 1929, 1930, where we are introducing the BIS. And again, the BIS couldn't have existed without World War I. And the German debt is the pretext for how we need a global government. Now, of course, empires have always sought global government, but the difference in this Atlantis empire attempt is that it's a shadow banking government. and it's central. Its whole, the ultimate plan, the totality of it, is exercised through, again, the erecting of the same central banking model in all the nations. And the BIS then becomes the central bank of the central banks. That's its point. And that's how World War I was ultimately about global government. And this is what Quigley says on page 310. Well, and the previous page I just read, 305. So basically pages 305 to 310 completely support that, quote, conspiracy thesis. It's not a conspiracy, it's just geopolitics, just power plays. And so the BIS is established in Basel, Switzerland, and it is owned by the chief central banks of the world and holds accounts for each one of them. The BIS was to serve as the central banker's central bank and allowed international payments to be made by shifting credits from one country's account to another on the books of the bank. I wonder if this is a recipe for scams. I don't know. Could be. No, I don't think. Surely not. The Young Plan was to serve as a final settlement of the reparations question. It lasted for less than 18 months. The crash of the New York stock market in October of 1929 marked the end of the decade of Reconstruction and opened the decade of destruction between these 2 years. The crash ended the American loans to Germany. So that's, again, same model as the IMF, except here it's just America, i.e. in this case, J.P. Morgan's banks loaning to Germany to bring them back under endless debt slavery, or to put them under endless debt slavery. Germany's net foreign debt, public and private, was increased in the same period by 18.6 billion marks, aside from the reparations. This is just insane. It stacks up and stacks up and stacks up. Right? He says this created a great drain on the German gold reserves. And so once this dwindled, the volume of money and credit erected on that reserve had to be reduced by raising interest rates. Prices fell because of the reduced supply of money and the reduced demand, so that it became almost impossible for banks to sell collateral to other countries, or and properties to other countries to obtain the funds to meet the growing demand for money. At this point, in April of 1931, Germany announced a customs union with Austria. France protested that such a union was illegal under the Treaty of Saint-Germain, by which Austria promised to maintain independence from Germany. This dispute was referred to the World Court. World Court. Moved towards global government. And in the meantime, the French, to discourage attempts at both of this union, recall French funds from both Austria and Germany. Anyway, so the largest Austrian bank, the Credit Anstalt, which was a Rothschild bank, Quigley says, with extensive interests, almost control in 70% of Austria's industry. All right, now this is where the rise of Hitlerism and Nazism will gain sway amongst the Germans, because if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler will talk about the Jewish bankers basically destroying the German economy, the German economy, right? The Rothschilds and the Austrian government gave the Credit Anstalt $160 million to cover the loans, for the public confidence have been destroyed, and a run on the bank began. To meet this run, the Austrian banks called in all the funds they had in German banks. The German banks began to collapse, so they had a run on the banks, and these latter began to call in all their funds in the London banks. The London banks began to fall, and the gold flowed outward. On September 21st, England was forced to go off of the gold standard. During this crisis, the Reichsbank lost 200 million marks in gold reserves and foreign exchange in the first week, and the discount rate was step by step to 15% without stopping the loss of reserves, but destroying the activities of the German industrial system almost completely. So, long story short, these machinations destroyed German industry, basically, is what it did. Now, this is where we begin to get into, as I said, the intense. Let's see. I think he says it's. Yeah. So specifically, America offered to postpone all the payments it owed to it by Germany, if its debtors would extend the same privileges to their debtors. And so the German economic crisis is really coming into full sway. And this is what is going to lead to anger in Germany. And he says that the Reichsbank had its worst run in July 7th. On the following day, the North German Wool Company failed with a loss of 200 million marks. And this destroyed the Schroeder Bank with a loss of 24 million marks. And the Darmstadter Bank, the big four banks of Germany, basically fell apart, except for a credit of 400 million marks from the Bank for International Settlements. There you go. Oh, we'll save you. BIS steps in. Germany obtained little assistance. Several committees of international bankers discussed this problem, but the crisis became worse and affected London. Now, November of 1931, all the European powers except France and her supporters were determined to end reparations because it was affecting everybody's economy. In 1933, now here we go. Here's where it gets key. Technically, this meant that the Young Plan would still be in force, but no real effort was made to restore it. And in 1933, Hitler repudiated all the reparations. So one of the reasons that Hitler was popular and came to power was that you had a bad economy, and Hitler says, well, we're just not going to pay it. By that date, reparations, which had poisoned international relations for so many years, were being swallowed up in other more terrible problems. And so before he says we get to World War II, we're going to have a chapter 7, finance, commercial policy, and business activity. But he sums it up by saying the question of how much was paid is an interesting question. This arose because of a dispute regarding the value of the reparations paid before the Dawes Plan. From 1924 to 1931, Germans paid 10 billion marks. For the period before 1924, German estimates of reparations were 56.5 billion marks, while the Allied estimate was 10 billion. So Germany says, we paid you 56 billion, and the Atlanticist says, the establishment says, no, actually, we only see 10.4 billion. Since the German estimate covered everything that could possibly be put in, including the value of all the naval vessels, a fair estimate would be about 30 billion marks for the period before 1924, or about 40 billion marks as a whole. So Germany has paid $40 billion in reparations. And he says sometimes it's argued that Germany actually paid nothing because they borrowed the money from abroad. This is not true, since the total foreign loans were less than 20 billion, while the Allies' estimate was over 21 billion. However, it is quite true that after 1924, Germany borrowed more than it paid in reparations, and thus the real payments on these obligations were all made before 1924. The foreign loans which Germany borrowed could never have been made but for the existence of these reparations in the reparation system. These loans greatly strengthened Germany by rebuilding its industrial plant. You see, so the bankers are wrecking Germany, and then they say, yes, as we will see with the Clivenden set, let's build it up. And this is where we get all the American industrialists, right? Because war will be tremendously profitable to, again, enslave the masses and enslave them through this, quote, public debt, which is not public debt. It's everyone's resources being sapped on like a parasite by a private banking class. And the burden of reparations as a whole on Germany's economy ended up actually post the collapse period. Before the collapse period, were not too hectic, he says, right? But then as we get up into the 20s, and as the German industrial sector begins to collapse from this banking crazyflation, right? Then that's where we're going to have Hitler saying, we're not paying. And this is going to lead to, as we said, World War II. Now, so how do we get to World War II? Well, Quigley says at the end of chapter 6 that it was a question of destroying the industrial sector of Germany, and then this begins to lead to inflation and public debt as we move into chapter 7, pages 316 and 17. And the bankers decide to suspend gold payments, and he says accepted the bankers' advice that the proper way to pay for the war was by a combination of bank loans and taxation of consumption. The period within which, according to experts, the war must cease because of limited financial resources, and fighting continued more vigorously than ever. He was talking about back at the beginning of the war. Or excuse me, I think he's talking about the beginning of World War II, what's going to happen. He says the period within which, according to the governments paid for the war in various ways: taxation, fiat money, borrowing from the big banks, and borrowing from the people by selling war bonds. Right? Just scam after scam after scam. Each of these methods of raising money had a different effect upon the two chief financial causes of the war. What were the causes of World War II? Inflation and public debt. The effects of the four ways of raising money upon these two are seen as follows. Taxation gives no inflation and no debt. Fiat money gives inflation and no debt. Bank credit gives inflation and debt. Sales of bonds give no inflation but give debt. So it would appear from this table that the best way to pay for the war would be taxation, and the worst way would be bank credit. However, taxation sufficient to pay for a war would have to be so severe that it could not be done. And so how does it end up being? Well, it ends up being the worst way. Wartime inflation. The worst way to pay for the war is debt to the bankers. So massive inflation ensues, 319, right? And these reparations are, as we said, unpayable. And inflation and increase in public debts continued after the war ended. The causes for this were complicated and varied from country to country. In general, the causes were price fixing and rationing regulations were ended too soon, before the output of peacetime goods had risen to a level high enough to absorb accumulated purchasing power. The Allied exchanges, which had been controlled during the war, were unpegged in March of 1919 and at once fell to levels revealing great price disequilibrium between the various countries. Purchasing power held back during the war suddenly came into the market. There was an expansion of bank credit because of post-war optimism. Budgets remained out of balance. Production of peacetime goods were disrupted by revolutions in Hungary, Russia, and so forth. Then there were strikes in the U.S., Italy, France. This post-war inflation, and again, it's in ways it's global, right? Because think of the U.S. Crash. This leads to a period of, quote, stabilization from 1922 to 1930. So we still haven't gotten to World War II yet. We're just looking ahead kind of to what the causes are going to be for World War II. And so the most important factor, I think, in sections chapter 7 in this beginning is the inflation and the debt, again, to the public debt signed on to the bankers. Same scam that the IMF runs today. I can't stress that enough, because we're still living in this world, right? I mean, we think that perhaps we are living in some kind of alternate modern system or something that's different than it was back in. No, it's not any different. Right? I mean, you may be using a debit card or swiping your iPhone, but it's still all the same scam. What's the U.S. national debt? There you go. Right? So I thought we won the wars. Why are we in such debt? Well, because it's not about winning the war and getting the money. It's about all of the people in all the countries being in debt to the bankers. And that's one thing that wars are good for. The wars put you in debt to the bankers, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's geostrategic implications to wars. There's corporate interests involved in war. There's social engineering aspects of war. But the best thing that it does is it puts everybody in debt to the bankers. Public debt to the bankers. And as we will see, FDR and his supposed solutions, according to Quigley, all his solutions are paid for by banker money, putting the nation into debt again to the bankers. So give me a break about your FDR, socialism, communism. Okay, give me a break. Come on. Quigley says it's all paid for by the public debt is all run up to the banks to pay for all of FDR's big social projects, right? The TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, Manhattan Project, and all this stuff. Now, I know about that. I'm from Tennessee, so I know about TVA. I live near a giant lake, massively extending through 2 or 3 states, created by the TVA. So, FDR, thank you, I guess, except that, of course, you paid for all this by putting the public into debt to the bankers, who are the ones who engineered the crash to begin with. So let's not forget that either, that essentially Quigley admits that as well, that the crash was due to rigging of markets. Now, in addition to these pragmatic goals, the powers of financial capitalism, this is where we have this classic important quote on page 324. And this will be one of the central, most important quotes in the book. Again, page 324. And we're going to have to read this to really get the meat of it and understand it all. So bear with me here, because if you don't understand this, you're not going to get the thrust of the entire book. Because you've heard me saying it, saying, Quigley talks about the bankers engineering the wars. And I'm going to read you what he actually says about this very point, where he says it. Okay, and again, Quigley's writing from the CFR archives, from the establishment's perspective, saying how it's done. In addition to these pragmatic goals, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, and it was nothing less than to create a world system. What did I just tell you? World government is the point of World War I. A financial control by public progressive banks. No, not public banks, by private banks, able to dominate the political system of every country. What did I just tell you about the BIS setting up the same central banking system in all the countries? And the economy of the entire world, global government, achieved through principally one single economic system. The system was to be controlled by a feudalist, in a feudalist fashion. Listen to my talk with James Kelly about Frankish feudalism. By the central banks of the world acting together through the apex of this system at the BIS. I mean, I've said this for 100 times in talks, interviews in the last 2 years. A private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private. Each central bank in the hands of men such as Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank, all sought to dominate its government by the ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchange markets, to influence the level of economic activity in every country, or in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. So the politician is a whore who goes into politics to win favor from the bankers to then make money in the corporate world. Right. So that's the entire lobbyist scam right there. But there you have it. That's the totality of the plan and the program laid out for you right there. And I could even say it more explicitly than that. Isn't it interesting that they sought to dominate all of the public governments through the control of treasury loans and to manipulate foreign exchange markets? That's also a big scam. And that's run because of a central bank of central banks called the Bank for International Settlements, which, as we said, would be the shadow cabal behind foreign currency exchanges. Right now, they can influence the level of economic activity in any of the member countries. They can influence the level of economic activity in the member countries. So that's how you can game and rig markets and create a boom-bust cycle. Boom-bust cycle is not a natural outworking of the invisible hand of Adam Smith or whoever, right? No, that's not how this system works. We're not in that system, right? That was like banker strategy beta, as I said, back in 1600s, 1700s. Now we're beyond that. We're into banker strategy BIS, the BS of the BIS. And that is based on manipulation of foreign exchanges, manipulation of treasury loans, manipulation of currencies, manipulation of economic activities in the countries, and to influence and manipulate cooperative politicians through economic rewards in the business world, lobbying and revolving door. There you go. Each country would have, in each country, the power of the central bank rested largely on its control of credit and money supply. What have I been telling you? Control of credit, money supply. And manipulation of interest rates, that would go under the aegis of control of credit. In a world as a whole, the power of the central bankers rested very largely on the control of loans and of the flow of gold. Yes, gold standard and control of the flow of gold is crucial. In the final days of the system, these central bankers were able to mobilize resources to assist each other through the BIS. So this is your hub here, right? BIS is the hub of all this scammery, where payments between the central banks could be made by bookkeeping adjustments between the accounts which the central banks of the world kept there. In other words, two sets of books like the mob or a front or a shell corporation, and they're scamming all the countries that are part of it. BIS is a private institution, and if you listened, I wrote an article on the BIS. I will probably link it with this talk. And in my article on the BIS, I include a guy's lecture who went there and wrote a book on it. His name escapes me at the moment. But he says this is a compound that I was watched every second that I was there to do my research. All right? So this is not like going to Yellowstone National Park or some sort of public institution where you can investigate, what's going on here. Right? That's, again, facade. This is a private institution owned by the 7 central banks. That is the big banks. And that would be like Bank of England, Federal Reserve, New York, and so forth. Operated by the heads of these, who together formed the governing board. So who runs the BIS? The governing board of the Federal Reserve banks of the big 7, G8, G7, G8, right? And that's that classification of G7, G8, and so forth. That actually comes out of the Royal Society as well, if you didn't know that. Each of these kept a substantial deposit at the BIS and periodically settled payments amongst themselves. Do you trust these guys to handle the public money? And between the major countries of the world through, quote, bookkeeping. Give me a break. Right? Loan sharks. In order to avoid shipments of gold. Oh, okay, right. So it's we just don't want to haul around a bunch of gold. That's why we're going to do this. So don't worry, we're going to take care of the bookkeeping because we don't want to lug a bunch of gold around. They made agreements on all the major financial problems in the world. They made agreements on all the major financial problems of the world, as well as the economic and political problems, especially in reference to loans, payments, economic future of the globe. One more time. This group made agreements on all the major financial problems of the world, as well as on many of the economic and political problems, especially in reference to loans, payments, and the economic future of the chief areas of the globe. Page 324. Now we're going to get into a little bit about the BIS here, but again, that was one of the key pages in this book. And if you don't read through now you might see that one quoted, in different alt media circles or whatever, but you really have to read the book page by page to get all the meat. But if a lot of you out there can't, which is why I'm doing this and why you're paying me to hear all of this, if you are listening to this and you're listening to this free hour, as we conclude here, you're hearing my lectures on the entirety of Tragedy and Hope, which is so packed with nuggets and meat that you're not going to see or hear elsewhere, right? That's why I'm doing this, and that's why you need to subscribe to Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or $60 a year to get the full archives of lectures and interviews. And I think the archives are getting up to, I don't know, over 100 audios at least. And you've got a whole section on Republic of Plato, many of the dialogues of Plato, and we are now moving up into page 324 and 5 of Tragedy and Hope. And again, you're getting a lot of meat. I save a lot of the juicy morsels and goblets of mead for the second hour. So you've heard some good stuff here in hour 1, to be sure, but there's going to be really good stuff in hour 2. And what we covered here in hour 1 was, again, the strategy of the bankers, basically proving and showing how World War I was engineered by the bankers to, under the guise of reparations, pull Germany into an unpayable debt, which ultimately wrecks economies. Again, boom-bust cycles engineered by the bankers. That leads to, we'll solve this with the global government. See, then we won't have these great economic trials and tribulations and crashes. Of course, that never happens. The crashes and booms and busts continue. But again, it's chiefly useful for Quigley showing that, this section at least, that the bankers are in the background of all this. And it's by design. It's not accidental. The markets are not free. They're not operating under some invisible hand of self-determining commerce and choosing what you want to buy and what you don't. It's Coke and Pepsi, right? It's the same company that owns 2 different gross-tasting high fructose corn syrup products. Now, I'm not saying that Coke and Pepsi are the same company. I'm just saying that if it was, the same company, right? Do you want Colgate or do you want Crest, right? Maybe they're both Procter & Gamble. I don't know if they are, but they're both fluoride toxic garbage, right? Choose your garbage. You want garbage juice or you want garbage smoothie? So we've seen the power of the Bank of England, right, who's a big player in this. This is one of the chief members of the BIS. The BIS is just the big 7, and then the other member dupes that sign on to it. So it really is, you want to talk about the all-seeing eye on the dollar. What does it mean? All this mystical gobbledygook. No, it just means bankers. Okay, that's the eye of the pyramid, the bankers, right? And I'm not saying the mystical gobbledygook doesn't have some significance. It does, because it signifies the inner coterie of the bankers. The circle of initiates of Milner, right? This is the same. It's the Cliveman and Set who's the major players in this. That's who's in the background of this. And then, of course, all the other oligarchs from all the other countries who are on board with this plan. And it's a globalist plan for global government, and that's what we have to always remember, that it's always perpetually about the global government, and that's what Quigley defines, explicates, and shows the mechanics of so well. So that was hour 1, and I want to thank you for listening. We're going to have some really good meat in hour 2. So if you're listening to this, please subscribe to Jay's Analysis at the PayPal link for $4.95 a month and $60 a year if you want to choose that option, either one. And we will get into the next chapter and section that deals with finance capitalism moving to monopoly capitalism, questions of free trade, more on the BIS, the scientific socialism that will be implemented in certain countries as another test tube creation of the bankers. So thank you for listening. This has been Jay's Analysis, Lecture 2 on Tragedy and Hope, the free hour. Stay tuned for hour 2. Also, check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols, which you can purchase at Amazon or Trine Day Publishers.